Professor Edward Kelly, welcome to our podcast. It's such an honor to host you here, to have you here, because I'm a big follower of you, and I really look up to you and your work and your wisdom and your efforts in the enlightenment of humanity. So how we will begin is I would like to introduce you, because you have so much work that I will try to keep it short, so that people, our sisters and brothers who are for the first time seeing you, knows who you are and what your books are and what your studies are. And Professor Edward Kelly is a research professor. He has background in experimental psychology and neuroscience. He is currently a professor in the Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS, a research unit housed administratively within the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. Professor Kelly received his PhD in psycholinguistics and cognitive science from Harvard in 1971. He then, more than almost 15 years, worked mainly in parapsychology, initially at the J.B. Rhimes Institute for Parapsychology. After that, in the Department of Electrical Engineering at Duke, and finally, through a private research institute in Chapel Hill. Between 1988 to 2002, he worked with a large neuroscience group at the University of North Carolina, mainly carrying out EEG and fMRI studies of human somatosensory cortical adaptation in natural tactile stimuli. He returned full-time to psychical research in 2002, serving as a lead author of Irreducible Mind, where he was the main editor and the co-author, and then which was published in 2007, and then Beyond Physicalism in 2015, where again he was the main editor and co-author, and then his very recent book, which is Consciousness Unbound. He has done all this work, and these books you will love to read, and you will really be astonished by all the facts that he has shared with us. He's returning to control central long-term research interest, the application of modern functions neuroimaging methods to intensive psychological studies of paranormal or psi processes and psi-conducive altered states of consciousness in exceptional subjects. Oh my God. Oh my God. Oh my God. Thank you so much for coming to our podcast once again, Professor Kelly. So I would like to begin with the question, in the mainstream neuroscience, it is mostly believed that consciousness is generated by the brain. So what would you tell us about consciousness and the relation of the brain with consciousness?
Big subject. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. Let me give a little preamble here.
Okay.
I think probably everybody who watches this can agree that our postmodern civilization is a mess. And why is it a mess? Well, there are lots of reasons probably, but one of them is the kind of worldview that has come to dominate contemporary modern societies. The sort of secular humanism, which really got going particularly in the US in the early 20th century and has kind of taken over academia, taken over our educational institutions and practically everything else, science reporting, the humanities, even religious studies. I'm aware that Denise in particular has an anchor in the world of Sufism. I don't know nearly as much about Sufism as I would like to, but I'm certainly aware that it has a great deal in common with various other mystically informed religious philosophies and world traditions. And what I would like to do during our time together is to explain how it's come to pass that I, from a strictly scientific point of view, have arrived at a picture of the world that is remarkably close, I think, to this group of religious philosophies. And in the course of talking about that, I will certainly address this issue about mind and brain, because it's right at the heart of everything. So let's go back to the beginning, or my beginning anyhow. I was in graduate school working on my dissertation. And at that time, I'd say, I, like every other person I knew virtually, implicitly subscribed to a picture, this physicalist picture of the world. And let me start by saying it's not something that we had arrived at by, late night conversations or arguments or one sort of, you just kind of absorbed it from the atmosphere of the labs that we worked in. Anyway, this is the modern sort of austere philosophical descendant of what used to be called materialism in previous centuries. And it comes in a variety of subtly different flavors, but it basically goes like this. All facts are determined in the end by physical facts alone. Reality consists at bottom of some kind of little bits of ultimate material stuff, which are moving around in accordance with mathematical laws under the influence of fields of force. Everything else has to be built from that ultimate stuff, whatever it is. We, like other organisms, are just immensely complicated biochemical machines. Everything in mind and consciousness, indeed even consciousness itself, is manufactured by neurophysiological processes occurring in our brains. When we die, our brains go, and therefore we go too. Lights out, end of story. There is no possibility of any form of postmortem survival. And if we look around more generally, we find out that we're on this tiny speck in a vast cosmos that shows no signs of meaning or purpose. Steven Weinberg, the quantum theorist, in one of his books says something like, the more we learn about the universe, the more it seems pointless. So that's the basic physicalist story, and it's pretty grim, I think you'd have to agree. But of course, it could be true. Is it true? Well, I don't think so. And that's what we're here to talk about. There are already plenty of signs. For example, the physicalist picture is very strongly anchored to the classical physics of the late 19th century. And we all know, even us non-physicists, that a lot has changed since then. With the rise of relativity and quantum theory, the foundations of physics have undergone a seismic shift. And it's no longer so clear that the old ideas even hold at our scale. Most of that stuff occurs at scales too large or too small or too speedy for us to really relate to in our everyday lives. And lots of scientists want to explicitly maintain that, well, classical physics remains a reasonable description of how things are at our level. Others disagree, including me, but I don't talk about physics because too many psychologists do that. There's also been a lot of movement, actually, in the last 20 or 25 years within philosophy of mind, to the extent that a number of very eminent philosophers are now convinced that not only do we not have an explanation of how consciousness could arise from a system of this classical physical sort, but that we will never be able to obtain one. So there's already plenty of indications that physicalism is false. Now, the work that I've done concerns various kinds of human psychophysical capacities. And this got started right at the end of my graduate school career. The way it came about was that I got a call one day from my mother who wanted to inform me that my older sister had become a medium. And it was clear right away that she was a little worried about this, and since I was a graduate student in psychology, I should know all about it, right? Well, I had no idea what she was talking about, but I promised I would look into it. And when I did, I quickly discovered that my hero, William James, had spent a large part of his adult life involved with these things, and that there was quite a big literature of experimentation on things generically called psi phenomena. That's a sort of theoretically neutral term that covers all the familiar categories of things like extrasensory perception, including clairvoyance, telepathy, retrocognition, precognition, and psychokinesis, or mind over matter. So here are all these articles done by people who seemed to know what they were doing, using the same kind of techniques and language that I had learned in studying ordinary, everyday mental capacities. So it was clear right away to me that if the reported findings were correct, then something was seriously wrong with our physicalist belief system, because these things seem to be, and most people still agree they are, prohibited essentially by classical physics. And yet here was evidence that they seem to occur. All right, well, I took that in, and as I finished my dissertation, I began reading in this literature and became convinced, almost convinced, that, you know, these things are for real. And by God, if they are, they're important. So maybe I should try to study them myself. And I struck up a conversation with J.B. Ryan down in Durham, North Carolina, as a result of which he invited me to join the staff at the usual drill, which 6-month trial period, $400 a month. One doesn't go into this subject in order to make money, I can assure you of that, contrary to widespread suspicions. It's a tough business still, and actually, in hopes that there are lots of young people seeing this, I'd encourage you to be interested in the subject for reasons we're talking about, but I'd also encourage you to be very careful about how you pursue those interests. And in general, it's probably wise to get established in some scientific area before you announce to anybody but your closest friends and allies that you have these interests, because they still can be very damaging to a professional career. Anyway, that aside, I then went down to Durham, and without going into the details of it, I had the enormous good fortune within the first month of being there to encounter a guy who was undoubtedly one of the best subjects ever to come into a parapsychology laboratory. This guy could do essentially anything we asked him to do at astronomical levels of statistical significance. So whatever doubts I had about the reality of the phenomena was immediately erased by him. And one message of this talk is that you can take it to the bank that psychic phenomena really do exist. And somehow or other, we are going to have to modify our scientific worldview in order to accommodate that fact. I then went on to try and develop a research program of my own, and partly because of this guy, I became for the first time interested in physiology. And the idea was to try to find things about what might be happening in his brain that would predict his success in a controlled psi task, experimental task. And for that reason, and also because I couldn't convince J.B. Ryan that this was a worthwhile thing to do, I migrated over to the School of Engineering, to the electrical engineering department at Duke, where some people were already interested in this kind of stuff and starting to build a lab. And again, without going into the details of that, we accomplished enough despite chronic shortages of cash and people to convince us that this was going to be a productive track if we could just keep it going somehow. Well, as it turned out, we were not able to keep it going. We ran out of money and ran out of welcome in the School of Engineering. We had there was a dean of the School of Engineering at that time, a man named Alex Vesich, who was a civil engineer, who amazed me in a conversation with the president of Duke University that I was present for. And he announced that in his opinion, the most important developments in physical science would emerge in conjunction with advances in parapsychology over the coming generations. So he was a great supporter of ours, and we had support within our department as well. But unfortunately, Alex Vesage died in 1980. He got Rocky Mountain spotted fever of all things and died of it. He was the first victim in that year. And the new chairman came in and a new dean eventually, who was very unfriendly to psychical research. And meanwhile, I'd had 2 kids by my first wife and had to put food on the table. So for that reason, basically, I migrated back into mainstream research and doing this neurophysiology stuff, and was able in that environment to continue developing all of our technical apparatus, which I hoped eventually to apply to paranormal stuff. So that went on until about 1992. Let's see. Well, actually, it went on until about 2002, but in 1993, I guess it was, I formed a relationship with my current wife, Emily, who had been working at the Division of Perceptual Studies, Personality Studies, as it was called then, at UVA, already for quite a long time. And we were married in 1998, and right about the same time, we were invited by Mike Murphy, who is the co-founder of Esalen Institute out in Big Sur, California, to participate in a new fellowship that he was creating under the auspices of the Center for Theory and Research. This is a little known think tank arm of Esalen Institute that Mike uses to pursue his own enormously varied intellectual interests. Mike, I should say, is really in the direct line from the founders of the Society for Psychical Research in England in 1882. Guy reads enormous amounts of stuff, remembers everything, and can marshal it in any conversation. Wonderful guy. That's why we dedicated one of our books to both him and Ian Stevenson, Emily's mentor. So anyway, Mike understood perfectly that if physicalism is true, there can be no survival. Now, note that proximity cuts both ways, because if survival occurs, then physicalism is false, period. And Mike was aware that there are people scattered around the planet who are producing evidence consistent with the possibility of some kind of postmortem survival. For example, So we assembled. There were about 20 of us initially, and we began by presenting and discussing various kinds of survival evidence. And that went on for a couple of years. The basic mechanism of CTR is an annual 5-day conference out at Esalen, supplemented, of course, by various behind-the-scenes interactions, smaller meetings here and there. But still, the first couple of years were mainly devoted to presentation of evidence. And we all found that survival was certainly a contender for the explanation of this evidence. But we also realized that we were all opponents of physicalism. And so we hatched a plan, which was to produce a thoroughgoing attack on physicalism in 2 overlapping stages. In stage 1, we would seek to assemble in one place a whole lot of evidence inconsistent with the physicalist picture, and I'll get to that in a moment. Then in the second phase, we would go on and try to figure out how must the world be differently constituted in order that all these kinds of things can happen. So that was the basic plan. So the vehicle for the first part was to be a book that had been published by F.W.H. Myers, one of the founders of the SPR, 1903, called Human Personality and Its Survival of Bodily Death. And so what we sought to do was to revisit a lot of the topics that Myers had covered in light of the subsequent 100 and something years of research in referee journals and so on. And so that's what we did. Now let's go back to the absolute basics of the situation. Everybody agrees that there are strong correlations normally between mental activity and brain activity. So what's the causality? Well, the normal way of sorting that out is to manipulate one side and see what happens on the other. So for sure, we know that physical things affect mental things. If you get hit hard enough on the head, or ingest a psychedelic, or grow an invasive brain tumor, mental things change. Well, you say, wait a second, I decide I'm going to raise my hand and up it goes. Isn't it of a mental thing causing a physical thing? Well, a physicalist reply to this is you misunderstood the causality. What really happened, you see, is that thought or impulse that you experience is really just a process going on in your brain, and it's that caused your hand to go up, not the thought itself. Physical causes physical, no problem. Now that's deceptively simple. It's a very difficult argument to overcome. And the basic way we sought to overcome it was by identifying a number of things that resist or defy explanation in terms of unaided brain processes. So that's the name of the game. Certainly the first thing on everybody's list would be all these psi phenomena and of course the evidence for survival. Now, we didn't want our book to be a parapsychology book per se, so we basically incorporated all that by reference and provided an annotated bibliography. And by the way, what I'm talking about here is this book, the first biggie, which contains all this stuff. And notice that neither do we have to get into much discussion of the core problem of the survival evidence, which is the possibility that some or even all of it might be explained entirely in terms of psi-like interactions among only living persons.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very big, contorted subject. I won't attempt to go into it now because either horn of that dilemma is fatal to physicalism, basically. So that was the first thing. Now, lots of scientists are aware of the conflict from psychical research, and they hope it can be successfully isolated and quarantined. That is, the view that they would like to take is that, well, we're succeeding everywhere else. This is just some weird little subject. Let's just put it off in a corner somewhere and pretend it doesn't exist. Well, that turns out to be far from true because there are lots of other things that resist or defy explanation. And I'll just sketch for you the other contents of irreducible mind, the other kinds of empirical phenomena. We have a big chapter written by Emily on extreme psychophysical influence. And this works its way toward things like stigmata, people who display the wounds of Christ from the crucifixion because they have an intense imaginal engagement with that situation. Things like hypnotic blisters, where a Janet suggests to a patient that he's going to touch her with a red hot poker in the shape of a star, and lo and behold, a star-shaped blister appears. Now, we know things about how a hot poker would produce a star-shaped blister, but not how it can be done by the mind itself. And there are other things of that sort in that chapter. It's really an excellent summary of that whole area. Then we had a chapter on human memory by Alan Gauld, who has spent a large part of his life studying that subject. And this is probably the hardest chapter in the book, actually, but he rehearses a number of unexplained aspects of the human memory system in particular. There's been a lot of progress on molecular mechanisms of, behavior modification and aplesia, sea slugs and things of that sort. But we're still short of any real understanding of the inner parts of human memory. Then there's a real important chapter by Adam Crabtree on psychological automatisms and secondary centers of consciousness. Adam knows a lot about this. He's a clinician who has studied a number of multiple personality cases. And the really interesting ones are ones in which the secondary personality is more gifted and able, informed, knows lots of things that the everyday personality doesn't know about. And in some of the most interesting cases, knows a good bit about what goes on in the conscious mind of the everyday self, but not vice versa. And for various physiological reasons, that poses huge problems for the conventional understanding of the relation between a mind and a brain. Then comes a chapter that I personally think will ultimately become possibly the most critical empirical argument against physicalism. And this has to do with things like out-of-body and near-death experiences, and in particular, near-death experiences that occur under extreme conditions, such as deep general anesthesia and or cardiac arrest, in which, according to the current opinion in neuroscience, there should be no experience whatsoever. And yet people are not only having experiences, some people, not everybody, but having the most intense and transformative experiences of entire lives. There are bunches of these. Some have been written up in books, like Eben Alexander wrote about his experiences during a coma induced by a bacterial meningitis, went on for a week, and he had repeated mystical experiences. Anita Morjani, there's a wonderful book by her. She was at death's door from tumors scattered through her body, and she not only recovered after her near-death experience, but all the tumors melted away over the next several weeks. And these cases, mind you, are coming right out of the absolute heartland of contemporary biomedical science. We're getting better and better at retrieving people from the borderland of death, and we're finding more of these cases. And I think this is something that even physicians who are among the most resistant minds about physicalism are having to pay attention to these cases. Then we had two further chapters. One was about genius, and here we're getting into things that are not so obviously conflicting with physicalism, but certainly hard to accommodate within it, and generally ignored or pathologized and devalued by most of the science that's occurred so far. In the case of genius, for example, I mean, there's been a certain amount of attention to that in psychology, quite a big literature, even though it's a relatively tiny part of the whole field. But most of what's in it is pretty shabby stuff, in my opinion, that deals just in the shallows of the subject. When you encounter someone like the Indian mathematician Ramanujan, that guy just absolutely beggars the conceptual apparatus that's available at present to cognitive psychology. He's extraordinary, just off the charts, but not entirely on his own. I mean, there are other people who show a lot of the same kinds of stuff, including psychological automatisms, creative bursts that have come up or down from somewhere. We don't know quite where. It's even worse for mystical experience. I mean, there's virtually nothing in it in the psychology or neuroscience literature after William James. James, of course, who was a big buddy of Myers and used Myers' model explicitly, by the way, in varieties of religious experience to attempt to understand various kinds of religious phenomena, including mystical experience. And he describes the mysticism chapter in VRE as the chapter from which all others get their light. That's how seriously he took the subject of mysticism. His excellent example has not been followed in general by psychology and neuroscience since that time. There's very little there, and most of it, like I said, devalues and pathologizes the subject. You know, neurologists talk about stuff like temporal lobe epilepsy, maybe, hypothetical, or other brain disorders. And oh gosh, there was this absolutely awful report in about 1975 or 76 by a thing called the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, which at the time consisted mostly of psychoanalysts. And they took Freud's line that this was a regression to a sort of pathological, infantile's oceanic state of consciousness, had no meaning of any kind for anything important in adult human life. I mean, that's the kind of level of stuff that's been there. At the same time, other things have happened. There was the 1960s, for example, when psychedelics penetrated the counterculture. And literally, in the US at least, millions of people had powerful experiences induced by things like LSD and psilocybin. And I still get emails from people who today are trying to figure out what happened to them in 1965 or something of that sort. So they're out there. And there have been some developments in the world of mystical scholarship, mainly through religious studies, but also in philosophy. A very important book, I think, by Walter Stace in 1960 called Mysticism and Philosophy had a big impact on me. Unfortunately, had a kind of a, well, ultimately okay, I guess, but temporarily bad impact on religious studies. It precipitated this kind of backlash against perennialism about mysticism. You know, there are schools that think that all mystical experiences are identical and teach the same lessons. And it's much more complicated than that. And some of these scholars of religion really kind of went to the other extreme in terms of denying the value of comparative scholarship and emphasizing differences between traditions about mystical experience in particular. Anyway, so all that stuff resulted in our book, Irreducible Mind, which is about 800 and something pages. We also took a very quick stab at the theory side, and we basically contrasted two somewhat extreme views, one being a kind of retooled version of Cartesian dualism, that is substance dualism, and the other being Whitehead's process metaphysics, which is more of a kind of dual aspect monism, I guess, or something of that sort. I called it neutral monism for some reason in Irreducible Mind, but that's probably not accurate. Anyway, the point was to show that we're not limited to physicalism either. Not only does it not seem capable of explaining all this stuff, but there are other respectable possibilities available that seem potentially capable of explaining at least some of these things. And I think we did enough to establish that, even in the context of Irreducible Mind. However, we then went on to more explicitly phase 2 of our project. And again, it took a while to get it organized and figure out how to move forward. But we eventually assembled a group of people, including physicists, philosophers, and scholars of religion, in order to examine a variety of world historical systems that took the reality of the various kinds of phenomena cataloged in Irreducible Mind seriously, and attempted to construct a philosophical system or conceptual framework or worldview capable of accommodating them. So that led to the second book, which Denise already mentioned. That's this big guy, Beyond Physicalism.
Beyond Physicalism.
And it includes, well, several things in there. First is a chapter which just basically summarizes the main contours of Irreducible Mind, sparing you the other 750 pages. Then there's a very important chapter by Paul Marshall. Paul Marshall, let me just say, is an absolutely crucial addition to our team. I discovered him because he wrote a great review of Irreducible Mind for the Journal of Consciousness Studies. Now, Paul is a guy who combines considerable understanding of physics. He was a physics major at Cambridge, but he's also a person who has had a mystical experience late in his career at Cambridge, which altered the course of his life. He was so impressed with it that he's redirected his life, went into religious studies at a university in the UK. And he now has the physics, a direct mystical experience, vast knowledge of the mystical literature, and a deep understanding of contemporary philosophy of mind and metaphysics as well. I'll get back to Paul in connection with our latest book where he plays a more prominent role. Anyway, in Beyond Physicalism, what he did was he wrote a chapter arguing for the view that we really should consider mystical experiences to provide windows into deeper parts of reality that are basically left out of the Western metaphysical tradition. And he's fully aware of all the complications. I mean, these windows aren't crystal clear. They're covered up with stuff derived from, psychology and culture and all that. And yet they can be very useful in terms of trying to arrive at a more comprehensive metaphysical picture. And then we have a chapter from Mike Grosso, which surveys the kind of world history of views of the type. Oh, and I left out something that's very important about irreducible mind. Let me go back to that for a moment. I think the single most critical accomplishment of irreducible mind was to show that the view of the human psyche held by both Myers and James has been strongly substantiated by the subsequent 100-year plus history of biomedical and psychological research. And it differs from the conventional view in specifically this way. It views the mind as cooperating with the brain under normal circumstances, but being at least functionally distinct from it and possibly ontologically as well. And what that picture does is it opens the path to postmortem survival. It removes the logical objection to survival. This is the so-called James's permission or transmission model. It's often called the filter model these days, by analogy with stuff like our TVs and radios, that take signals from some other place. And psychologically speaking, the really crucial feature here is that for James, this opens up the path to what he called the more. He was just starting down that path in varieties of religious experience, but went on to develop it greatly in the last years of his life, and particularly in a pluralistic universe. And what it entertains is the idea that there's a region of our psyche, normally hidden from us, that contains all kinds of capacities that we normally don't have access to, but that can explain things like psi experiences in everyday life, uprushes or down rushes of creative genius, mystical experiences, and all those other sort of latent human potentials that, by the way, historically have been the main preoccupation of Esalen Institute. That's really all what it's all about, is identifying what potentials there are and trying to find ways of accessing them. So, Beyond Physicalism goes on. Oh, well, Mike Grosso's chapter kind of surveys the very distinguished lineage or history of such ideas in the history of thought. I mean, it goes back to pre-Socratics and it's all over the place. And Mike didn't even get into the Eastern part of the story, where you have things like, Advaita Vedanta and the various other traditions. And then, there's one further chapter. It's actually by myself and David Presti, who's a neurobiologist from Berkeley, in which we made a first stab at trying to guess what might be the sort of physiological correlates of this filtering process in the brain. And let me say here just that this picture that's emerging has enormous potential practical consequences. That is, we all agree, and David and I developed these ideas, that there must be something about certain kinds of brain conditions that permit these kinds of down rushes from the more into everyday life. And we have every reason to think that the kinds of neurophysiological and experimental methodologies that we have will permit us sooner or later to understand better what those conditions are, and perhaps to devise ways of making them more available to people in general, so that a practical consequence of this whole line of work could be to make mystical experiences, for example, more available to persons in general. And by the way, a really important feature of this NDE research, which you can read about in particular in my colleague Bruce Grayson's new book, After, is that people who have mystical experiences, which is what they are essentially in deep NDEs, become better people in general. Those experiences, I mean, he has a lot of information now about that. And from my point of view, a mystical experience that takes the form of a deep NDE is a mystical experience that was had under less than ideal circumstances, where you almost had to die in order to have the experience. What we'd like to do is make the experiences available without the necessity of actually almost dying. And I think that will be possible as time goes forward. I mean, we know, for example, that meditation procedures of various kinds lead in that direction. We have learned, despite resistance from the religious quarters, that some psychedelics are capable of producing real mystical experiences. And now we have the possibility of, you know, experimental study of mystical experiences induced properly by wise use of psychedelics, and studying the brain accompaniments of those experiences. So there's an enormous practical future in applied research along these lines. Okay, but then the remainder of Beyond Physicalism consists, well, all of part 2. We found no less than 9 different worldviews that merited a close look. And these include 3 from physicists, 2 of whom were quantum theorists, the other a relativity and string theory guy. We surveyed 3 of the traditional mystically inspired or informed religious philosophies, those of Neoplatonism, Patanjali and yoga, and non-dual Kashmiri Shaivism. And then we also discussed 3 systems sampled from Western philosophy. Leibniz's monadology, as modified by Paul Marshall in a way that permits it to explain more stuff. Charles Sanders' Peirce, Adam Crabtree wrote about that, and revisited Whitehead with a new twist drawn from Aurobindo and the Eastern, well, really the Tantric Vedantic tradition. Well, then in the last part, we tried to take a stab at figuring out what it all adds up to. And going just to the kind of philosophical portion of that, and this is my chapter 14 of Beyond Physicalism, what I did was to retrace William James's path. I mentioned how James in the Varieties had first really enunciated or articulated this picture of the more, this hidden part of the psyche, which he, by the way, describes in chapter 10 of VRE as, quote, an entirely unsuspected peculiarity of human constitution. And this, of course, came straight from Myers and Psychical Research. And it's Myers's idea of the subliminal self, you know, which encompasses the supraliminal self, the everyday ego or consciousness, but is much more inclusive and includes, as he put it, adits and operations of its own, which can explain some of these latent human potentials and so on. Now, right at the end of the Varieties, James advertises that he foresees the possibility of extending this kind of psychological picture in a more metaphysical direction. And he had actually said that when he first introduced the transmission theory. This was in 1897. He gave what was called the Ingersoll lecture at Harvard on two supposed objections to the doctrine of immortality. And the first of those was the idea that brain generates mind. There's a dependence of mind on brain, and he pointed out that that relationship can be explained in other ways. And in doing so, he looked to Fechner, German physicist and psychologist. And in a long footnote, he mentions that, I'm speaking here in kind of customary dualistic terminology, but I can foresee the possibility of going beyond it to a more monistic kind of solution. So that's what he really did in A Pluralistic Universe. The basic story, and it's all spelled out at the end of chapter 14 in Beyond Physicalism. And I realize I'm wearing on and on here. Is it okay if I talk on for a bit?
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, I'm getting charged up here. Yeah, encouraged basically, not only by Myers. I mean, James early on had an aversion to the idea of, the possibility that a state of consciousness could simultaneously both be itself and be a part of a larger consciousness. In the Principles of Psychology, he's got a long argument against the mind dust theory, which is about this topic. Well, he revisited it in A Pluralistic Universe, published in 1909, his last book publication while he was still alive. There was one more that came out after his death. And he specifically points to Myers as having provided an empirical demonstration through the work on psychological automatism and secondary centers of consciousness, that whether we like it logically or not, this is a fact of nature, that this can occur. And encouraged then by Bergson and Fechner, he goes on to speculate about the further reaches of the subject. He says to the effect that, well, all the phenomena that I talked about in VRE, they come from the sort of near side of this subliminal whatever it is. Well, we don't yet know very much about the far side, what might lie out there, but he's willing to speculate about it. And speculation takes the form that there could be a hierarchy of more inclusive consciousnesses leading up to some highest level. And what might that be? Well, he wants it to answer to the everyday person's idea of a God or supreme being. But James had a tremendous aversion to the absolute idealisms that were prominent at that time, particularly in England. I mean, a lot of this that had come up before in philosophy, of course, it goes way back in the Eastern traditions, was certainly present in Plotinus and so on, came up again in the German idealists of the 18th and 19th century. But in Britain at the time was exemplified in particular by Bradley, and in the US at Harvard by James's colleague, Josiah Royce. Anyway, James sets out to attack these theories. He finds them monstrous. And the reason is they're kind of logical constructions. The idealists were really arguing that there has to be some final all-inclusive consciousness that's aware of everything in all of space and time. And they try to do this through logical arguments. But what James does in A Pluralistic Universe, PU, first attacks the logic and ends up concluding that, well, it's not compelling. And of course, it no longer is compelling to most philosophers. It's just a different empirical hypothesis about that highest integration. And in fact, he finds it monstrous. And he calls it various things at various places, but the one I like best is the unintelligible pantheistic monster. He finds it to be just alien to us as human beings. He wants his highest consciousness to be kind of like us in the sense that, maybe it doesn't notice things and maybe it forgets things. It's like us in those ways, and we can be more intimate with it. It gives us a, that's something we can relate to on a more personal kind of level. It's way beyond us, but, not totally out of reach like this logical construction of the idealists. And he had, more deeper reasons for wanting it to be that way. He wanted to absolve this higher being of all responsibility for evil. I mean, if there really is an absolute that's all encompassing, it apparently is responsible for evil as well. And we sure know there's plenty of that around. It would be nice if the highest being wasn't responsible for all of it by itself. And if we could conceive a situation in which we are trying to cooperate with that highest being and trying to advance civilization, that's really the kind of view that James is reaching for, and which I personally find enormously appealing.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of this long chapter in Beyond Physicalism, I basically argued that as a group, the authors of Beyond Physicalism and the traditions that they represent are all tending in the same kind of idealist direction, as James himself had pointed out in Varieties, that mystical experiences tend to drive people in this sort of a direction as a matter of empirical fact. And the picture that we sort of tentatively adopted as, not a final conclusion, but the sort of, and not even quite a common denominator of all the theories, but the sort of modal or most common central tendency of the various things that we had presented. And this is what's called evolutionary panentheism.
Mm-hmm.
Without going into details here, there's a lot of it in that chapter. Panentheisms try to split the difference between a traditional theism, that is entirely separate from the world, creates it, maybe lets it go on by itself, maybe intervenes or whatever, and pantheism, in which God is identified with the world itself as we normally encounter it. So in panentheism, there's a God who is fully present in the world. The world is real for sure, but there's something left over, kind of in the same relation that we are to our bodies, that we're in our bodies, but there's, we think, something in addition to it that's closer to our real self. So, exhausted again after that, I milled around for a few years, and then there was another conference out at Esalen. This one involved a number of physicists by way of Harold Ottmanspacher, by the way, who's a quantum theorist and who's been working on a form of dual aspect monism, which is in Beyond Physicalism, based on the very intense interaction between Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli. Jung, the psychologist, Pauli, the physicist, which has barely been scratched so far in the West. I mean, there are thousands of letters between these guys, and they had all kinds of meetings together. It's just beginning really to come to light in its full richness. Anyway, there were some other people at that meeting who presented stuff that, and Paul was there also, and we could immediately see that there was the possibility for a book 3 that would build upon Beyond Physicalism, and that's basically what happened. Consciousness Unbound came out in April. Is that it? Can you see that? Is it backwards? I can't tell what's going on, but that's the book.
We can see it. We can.
Okay. Yeah, it basically carried forward the main themes of both previous books. There's a part 1 in which we have state of the science summaries for near-death experiences by Bruce Grayson, and then a wonderful chapter on precognition by Bob Rosenberg, who's been associated with our group for a long time, but had not written anything in this public sort of way before. Then we have a part 2 in which there are 5, well, either sort of adjustments and improvements in 2 previous positions that we presented and several new ones as well, including by ones from some people who had really not been willing to come out in public before. These are chapters, for example, by Max Velmans, who's a major figure in the world of consciousness research. Bernardo Kastrup, who is a former CERN research guy, computer engineer turned philosopher, who's enormously productive and has produced what he calls analytical idealism. It is a form of in which there really is only one ultimate reality, a supreme consciousness, and everything else is somehow spun out of that. And then an extremely interesting guy, Federico Fagin, who was the inventor of the first microprocessors, several of them, physicist by training, who knows physics in depth, and who has also been having mystical experiences now for several decades and trying to figure out their implications for our basic picture of reality. And Federico, I think I'll make special mention of, because he has teamed up with an Italian theorist named Dariano, and they are attempting to work out a new picture that goes way beyond actually what's in his chapter in our book. And I can't possibly present it to you in an effective form, but I can sketch what they are trying to do and why I think it's so important. Dariano, it turns out, has a group which has been working for a couple of decades to try to explain all the principles of quantum theory from deeper informational principles of some sort. And what Federico has done in teaming up with Dariano is to push that back even a stage further to show that the informational principles themselves are grounded in consciousness. And Federico's theory, again, is one that takes consciousness as the primary reality underlying everything. So in effect, what you have is a movement within physics that is taking out, dissolving basically everything that we used to think of as physical and making it into something more mental. It's basically physics moving toward idealism, in my opinion, is what's happening. Can they pull it off? I certainly don't know, but I hope they do. Anyway, so, and then again, in Consciousness Unbound, we have a third part in which for the first time, we really start to turn toward looking at the implications of these emerging views for other big things. So David Presti, for example, has a wonderful chapter on its impact on the science of consciousness, ways in which that science could grow by taking these ideas on board. And there's a wonderful chapter by Jeff Kripal about the humanities. The humanities have been destructively colonized by this physicalism stuff, even into religious studies. It's amazing to me that half of the Academy of Religious Studies apparently is devoted to finding physicalist explanations of religious experience. And that's the way it's been for quite a long time. And Jeff is trying to kind of single-handedly change things within his field. And then the last chapter is by Paul Marshall. And what he does is he attempts to survey the whole landscape of mind-brain theory and associated metaphysical commitments. And he does it in a way that's highly organized by all of our previous efforts. I think this chapter, which is by far the longest in the book, is going to end up as a real landmark in the history of this subject. Paul is just absolutely brilliant guy who knows his stuff, writes magnificently well, and he ends up, basically underscoring the kind of consensus that we had developed by the end of Beyond Physicalism, and points out ways in which we can go on possibly to pit the still standing candidates against each other in a framework of questions that would identify work out their ways of handling each of 14 different questions and thereby try to evaluate them and come to some more final conclusion about what the best available picture is. So there, I think I've done what I hoped to do, basically.
You're wonderful. You're wonderful. May I make some comments from the perspective of a Sufi?
Yes.
We also believe that there are levels of consciousness, and that the main the fundamental fabric of the universe is consciousness itself. So I try to explain it like this: when we think of our brain as a virtual reality headset and our bodies as a Tesla suit, and when you wear them and you go in front of a screen where there is, like, you know, there's a forest, and you go in it and you begin to, you know, taste some strawberries and everything. So you are feeling that, you're living that, because the brain doesn't know the difference between what is imaginatory and what is real. So for the spirit, because you know, Rumi, I'm a William James fan too. Yes. And you know, because you know, Rumi and Ibn Arabi, these are two scholars who were telling us that they were Sufi masters. Rumi and Ibn Arabi, they say that we are living in a psychological universe. This is based on Quran. And we are actually in a dream. And to wake up from this dream, we have to die before we die. And how do we die? What they mean by death, because of Prophet Muhammad, is this: when these senses, the limits on the senses, get disappeared, when you break these limits on the senses, you wake up from this dream. So right now we are in a dream, and we are trying to step into the field of lucid dreaming, because the universe is a big brain. You're like a little brain connected to the big brain. So you are in interference with the big brain, but the big brain is also interfering, you know, is affecting you. You are affecting the big brain, like the collective consciousness, and it is affecting you. So it is like when they say the brain is generating the spirit, is the same thing as while you're wearing this virtual reality headset, you are claiming that virtual reality headset is generating the consciousness. However, it's not. But what's the difference? For example, Bernardo asks, says one mind. So why do we feel there are more than one minds? It's because of, it's like, I give the example of internet. There's internet all around, but the machines are different, or the electricity. Electricity in a refrigerator gives cold. In a stove, it gives, warm air. So it's the same electricity, but it is different. Its function becomes different according to its box. So what our differences is in the same consciousness is our DNAs. It is like this filter, this interface that is making us feel that we are separate and that we are experiencing the consciousness in a different way. But once you break the limits on these senses, you become the drop who reaches the sea. So Rumi says, you are not only the drop who reaches the sea, you are the sea in a drop. So that is how you reach the super consciousness, or whatever they call. So we say this is God's mind. So what we call consciousness is God's mind, because we believe we are made on thought. It's a psychological universe. We are experiencing ourselves. So I gave in my fifth book, I talked about William James and about the flow state, and because he's a genius. He right now you cannot find. I am talking about, except you and a few more scientists, you cannot find scientists like this, because it's very secular. I mean, they only work on one field. That's why they do not go deep into the other fields. But the universe is like a body. It is all integrated. You cannot separate physics from neuroscience. You cannot separate chemistry from physics. So to be able to understand the universe and yourself, your being, you have to know a taste of all these fields. You have to have a taste of them. I gave the example in my 5th book about Cold Blue Luke. Cold Blue Luke is a guy who was put into Alcatraz, the prison of Alcatraz. And he went into a fight there, and he was an armed robber. So they threw him to a cell which did not let any sound in, any light in. So he was actually being put in a retreat by force. So what happened is, after his 29th day, he began to see, because there was no light, there was nothing almost to eat, he couldn't hear anything in the cell that was so isolated. He began to see a sky that was more real than the sky he explained and defined. So actually, what we call as Sufis, he experienced dying before dying, because these senses, these limits, we are like ants. Ants see only 2 dimensions. For the ant, there's no 3rd dimension. So for the ant, you put him on the cover of your book, and he begins to go into circles because he cannot see the depth, the 3rd dimension. We are the same way. There are so many dimensions here, which the string theorists and all these scientists are talking about. And we see such little parts of the light spectrum, and we don't hear nothing. When we are totally deaf and blind, when you think of how limited we are. And then we try to come to decisions about the universe and ourselves as well. So people like William James, and these people, Newton, Einstein, Bergson, Whitehead, these people I also talked about in my books. These people were in philosophy. These people were in religion. They were not only doing science, they were trying to understand everything from a point of view that they understood they could not reach with these limits. So I think it's very important to understand that science is evolving. Science is evolving. I mean, they were talking about Big Bang. Now they're saying there are more than one Big Bangs, which I wrote about too, because of, based on Quran and in Sufism, we know that. So I think this is very important to take into consideration what philosophers were talking about. Plato is an amazing guy. What he's talking about is the same thing. The cave in Arabic, it comes from Arabic. It means the cave. It comes from the word kef. He's actually describing what Cold Blue Luke lived, what he experienced in this retreat in Alcatraz. So when you retreat from the stimuli of auditory system and the optical system and everything, you begin to experience other things. You begin to experience the limits on your senses begin to get, I'm a Sufi, and we do this all the time. And we fast and we do mantra, dhikr. And because we are like, just you were talking about this, and this is, I always talk about the brain as a radio or a TV. And because on one for example, when you are right now we are making a program with you, and you are there alive, and I'm here alive. When I will be broadcasting this in all the TVs and all my YouTube channels and everywhere, there will be millions of you, but there's only one you. Yes. What looks like millions of it is this holographic nature of our beings, actually. So I think what we call paranormal is normal. We are paranormal, because we think that what I'm touching is this table, which I know according to physics is that the electrons of my fingers will be pushing the electrons of this table. So there is no way that I can touch this. But I'm feeling that, and I feel it's so real, just like in a dream state. Everything is so real. Somebody hits you, you feel it. Somebody makes you cry and you wake up like so unhappy and this and that. So this is why I think the words are very important. The word reality comes from the Latin root, res. It means things, just like on a screen, on a computer screen. You see representations of the things, but not the things themselves. So this is why we believe our central nervous systems are like antennas, where actually our subjective reality and objective reality is according to the interface of that creature. For an ant, it's the same interface. For human, it's the same interface. But my subjective reality is based on my central nervous system's activity. So these people who we call schizophrenic, or these people who experience, for example, other dimensions or things, are actually, their central nervous systems are having big openings and closings, so that their TV is like a cable TV, which sees so many channels at the same time, where we are only watching one channel and we are thinking this is it, this is the universe. Mm-hmm. So
we think a lot alike, clearly.
Exactly.
A couple of things. The story about the guy in the prison reminds me of Aurobindo, in India, who was a anti-British, terrorist guy. They clapped him in jail, and there he had his first big mystical experience. Also, if you haven't looked at it already, you'll see in Federico's chapter in
yes.
He explicitly adopts the virtual reality scenario.
Yes. I was shocked because, because of having understood this way and writing about this for years. And because I met Federico through you, I didn't know him. So when I began to read you, I saw him, and we're going to have an interview with him too, after you. And it is, Professor Kelly, and the word philosophy comes from philo, Sophia. Philo means to love, and Sophia means wisdom. So I think what the problem with computer scientists these days is that they believe that the brain is like a computer, and so that this artificial intelligence can be like human consciousness and stuff. And what we call data and knowledge, it is raw information. When it is digested, it becomes knowledge, and when it is more digested and it becomes the action, it becomes wisdom. So I think there is no computer in this world who can reach wisdom, artificial wisdom. Yeah, they can reach artificial intelligence or data or information, whatever. But wisdom is something only for human mind and human heart, actually. And that is why I think the heart is very important, because we Sufis believe that the real online mechanism of the person is the heart. It is the real realizing part of the person is not the brain, it is the heart. And that the brain comes in a delayed realization of what we call the reality. So we have to that's why the word heart comes from the word card, which went into English in cardiology, which comes from the same root of according your instrument, accord. So actually, when we say my instrument, I'm a musician, as you know, I play the piano, is out of chord, I am telling the person that it is not in tune with my heart. It is not in tune with my heart. This is so amazing that I think we have to put the heart, the heart into the picture, just like the brain, because Benjamin Libet and all these experiments, and that we are living a delayed version. I have written a big paper for a university in the United States on free will and Sufism, and that's another.
Send me a copy, please.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
I will. Can I send you an overview for that, a smaller one, so that it won't? Yeah. So once we understand the consciousness, we will be actually understanding what time is, because these are all related issues. Free will, time, consciousness. We cannot separate these issues. Near-death experiences. And you were talking also about, in your book, the deep general anesthesia, and how, you know, those experiences have given these people another look of dimension. And could you please tell us a few like of those incidents that you were like, when you faced them, when you found about them, you were very you were like struck?
Well, I know Eben Alexander.
Yes.
Personal acquaintance, and he's actually a subject in my lab.
Yeah.
You know, I've read his books. I've talked to him at length. Bruce Grayson and two medical colleagues worked their way independently through the 600-something page medical report from his week in coma. I'm convinced there is absolutely no doubt that the man was very near death. In fact, anybody I know who knows these kind of things is astonished that he's even upright, let alone fully intact, which he certainly seems to be. And he reported a number of things during those experiences that could be verified as having actually happened at those times. And this is one of the main features of the most interesting near-death cases, in which the brain is disabled, and yet people can report things that occurred during the time of apparent unconsciousness. And there are something upwards of 100 such cases in the literature now. I personally think that they collectively establish that that is possible, and it's fatal to the physicalist picture. Most physicalists are, I think, deliberately ignoring this evidence because they understand the challenge and just don't want to hear it. It's, you know, it's like the Cardinals not wanting to look through Galileo's telescope.
Exactly. You know, history repeats. Yes. Yes. It is, history repeats itself. You know, when I'm talking to scientists, and when we talk about a new idea, for example, faster than light idea, because in Russia there are studies, and there are lots of scientists who claim there is this energy called the torsion energy that is faster than light, and that people can be in touch when they are talking about, you know, the law of the theory of entanglement and stuff. But they say, oh no, you know, they don't want to hear this. But when they are talking about Galileo and, you know, all these scientists, they're doing the same thing now. I mean, I don't understand how they can criticize what happened to Galileo, you know, and then they can still do the same thing again. I don't understand this. And especially when a scientist like you, which is really hard to find, comes up with a different idea to the mainstream idea. I don't understand why they try to find, you know, like loopholes in what is being said. I mean, they can, of course, but in a more, maybe in a more like kind way, because sometimes I know Donald Hoffman. He's a great guy. I had a Zoom meeting with him in December, and I have been to certain communities where he was making a talk, and some scientists attack him in a way, and I don't understand why, because this is very interesting. This is very interesting.
Yeah, there are plenty of histories of this kind of stuff in the history of science.
Yes.
And in fact, it's typically other scientists who resist real scientific advances.
Yes.
Because people, you know, they get to, they cherish their ideas, and physicalism is a real deep idea. It's a kind of a secular faith, basically.
Yes, it is a religion.
Yeah.
It is a religion. And, you know, when I'm talking to, you know, AI people, they say that they think that we are living in a simulation, which we also believe as Sufis. We are in a divine simulation. It's a dream. it's a divine dream. But they say we're in a simulation of a parallel universe boy who is playing with his, there are more than and we are in that computer. I mean, when you look at this, this is paranormal to me, and how to believe that, I cannot believe how someone could believe something like that, rather than a super consciousness, which we call God or whatever they want to call it. And making this, just like Max Planck said, there is behind this matrix a big wisdom and intelligence that is not human. It's not human. So it is very interesting, seriously, to be able to deal with these when we come. We're still talking about the past. We're still talking about Einstein and all these people who lived in the past century, because we cannot produce something new, just like William James. How many people have come just like William James? Do you know anyone like William James at the moment? No,
maybe.
People like you, people like you, only you. So and your team and the deep wisdom scientist like yourself. So Professor Kelly, there's too much to talk about. I mean, look, I have studied your work, your books, and there's so much, but I don't want to get you too tired on this, which I'm already feeling so gifted to have this chance with you. Is there anything you want to add to your
Actually, there's one thing.
Yes.
I think we agree that there's plenty of sort of world historical evidence of these kinds of ideas coming forward from religious traditions, from the arts, from philosophy. But I do think, in defense of science, that the new ingredient in the situation, and the one that's finally going to allow this picture to emerge as the newly dominant one, is the fact that it's being driven now also, not solely, but also by developments in science itself, both physical science and also the kind of science that I've been doing throughout my career. So I think we're going to win. I think we're on the winning team. I'm not sure we will see the end of the game, but let's count on that.
The word, when we were talking to you before our Zoom, which you had given me a chance to meet you before, we talked about the word consciousness and science. The word science comes from the root of shis. Kan means together with, and shis is the root word for science. So actually science is the unfolding of consciousness itself. It is not something different. It is, so that is why also I'm, as a research scientist, trying to bring consciousness with, spirituality, with, science, because they are exactly the sides of this, what we call, the coin, the two sides of the coin. But I would really suggest for anyone who would want to experience his limits, what's beyond his limits, to actually join retreats. Run by people like mentors who are aware of this and how to, because when you step into the field, there's Rupert Sheldrake. I'm sure you know him. I think he's also a great person who is also mostly attacked by certain mainstream media scientists. So when you go to retreats, and when we understand that we are like this ant who is like making circles on the cover of this book because he cannot see the depth, the third dimension, that will make us a different person. Just like you mentioned, near-death experiences, just like Cold Blue Luke in Alcatraz. He said it was so amazing that he said after his experience, this armed robbery guy, he said, I want to be a good person because I have experienced something that is more real than this universe more real than the sky. So, and the breath work, I think breath work, we work on breath, and the sound work also. We work on breath and sound. That will be very helpful because as you know, psychedelics are being used, but of course we do not suggest people to use psychedelics there and over there. But these things maybe could be suggested to step into, so that we have reproducibility in certain claims we make. That is, there is something beyond this thing that we call reality. That would be, I think, one of the points I would want to say. I thank you so much, Professor Kelly, and it is our pleasure. And hopefully, your final book is going to be translated to Turkish, and I would like to take some, cases from that and put into my new book with your interview, so that we can reach more people, because we have, thousands and thousands and thousands of followers and readers. So I'm hoping with my little knowledge and power, I can be a vehicle to your great work that you are providing to humanity for the sake of truth, not reality, but truth beyond reality.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.